Your beliefs aren't yours. They are inherited patterns from your lineage and crumbling institutions. This new moon in Sagittarius is a fire-fueled push to act. Stop defending old dogmas. It's time to dissolve the past and reclaim your divine design for this lifetime. Hey there, Truth Seeker. Welcome to the Star Kittens community where we discuss 13-sign astrology. Are you in alignment with your divine design? Do you want to master the metaphysical reality? Open the doors of perception. Each planetary body is an archetype, a template, if you will, that helps us interpret human behavior in the world around us. The more awake and aware we are, the more synchronicity will show up in your life. Our focus today is the Sagittarius new moon in the powerful stellium formed by Venus, Juno, the Moon, the Sun, and Mars. We'll also explore the tension created by their square to Saturn and Neptune in Pisces. To help us reach more souls with this important message, please like, share, and subscribe. There's a lot going on, so let's jump in.
Kia ora, David.
Kia ora.
The last one of the year.
Yes.
Exciting to be talking about this new moon energy, and I just want to set the scene a little bit. It is the time of year where a lot of people on the planet celebrate Christmas, and Christmas, of course, is a belief system that we have adopted as a society. And this new moon occurs here in New Zealand on the 20th of December at 2:43 p.m. in the afternoon, with the sun and moon conjunct at 1 degree Sagittarius. So Sagittarius is the energy of beliefs. How do we function very much is determined by the things we experience as a child. And that's where this whole Christmas theme kind of comes in, because if your family didn't celebrate Christmas, then you don't believe in Santa Claus, and this jolly man with the big belly and the white beard wouldn't be visiting your house. Whereas if you've grown up in the Netherlands, they celebrate Christmas. Here in New Zealand, a lot of families celebrate Christmas. So it is a tradition that stems from a belief system that your family has. So how does that little story tie into the new moon energy that we're talking about today?
Yeah, we were talking about that story with Santa Claus and going pretty deep on it in terms of how it relates to this new moon. And so let me back up a little bit and use the archetypes of each planetary body, and then we can fold in that story and some other stories as well. The sun and the moon, in this case, very strongly represent integration as they come together between the masculine and the feminine energies. So this is the one time in the lunar cycle of 28 days where the masculine and the feminine are one. So there is no differentiation between the two. So with that in mind, and as the prelude to the conversation that we're going to have today, the masculine and the feminine energy coming together at the new moon is also amplified and enhanced and by the presence of these other planetary bodies, where, as you pointed out before, we have Mars on the outside of what we call a stellium. So there's 5 planetary bodies all lined up there. And we have Venus at the other side. So reinforcing the idea of the masculine and the feminine, we have not only the sun and moon coming together for the new moon, we also have on the outside of the stellium Mars representing the male and Venus representing the female. And we have an asteroid, Juno, involved as well, that we haven't spent a lot of time talking about, but we use Juno in our astrological readings to differentiate between relationships, and these need not necessarily be a male and female relationship, but a serious committed relationship. We use Juno to represent the depth of those relationships, which many people assign to twin flame or soulmate or fated type relationships that hit you from nowhere, but you know when you've met that person. And this could be of the same sex. You know, there's nothing to suggest that this is simply a masculine and a feminine relationship. This could be any type of deep, committed, romantic and sexual relationship between two people who consider themselves to be twin flames or soulmates or fated or brought together. So we've got a very interesting dynamic here at this new moon involving clearly masculine and feminine archetypes of Mars and Venus, deep committed relationship in Juno, and the integration of the masculine and the feminine as the sun and the moon come together. Now, as we've talked about last time and at various times in various podcasts, the sign in which this is taking place provides the background energy or the resonance. And so with this being in Sagittarius, we have a fire sign, and a fire sign means that the emphasis is on action as opposed to a water sign where the emphasis will be on our emotions, or an earth sign where the emphasis will be on our bodies and our physical environment, or an air sign where the emphasis will be on our thinking. This case, and in this situation, this new moon is very specifically in a fire sign, and it is amplified by the presence of Mars, adding even more fire to the mix. And when I see that in any astrological configurational reading, what it says to me immediately is that source consciousness, the cosmos, the universal intelligence, wants us to act upon what it is that we interpret that this new moon means for us as an individual. And as a collective, we are to act upon the energies of this new moon. So there's very much a push, if you like, from the cosmos saying there are some important issues which we'll touch on as we discuss today. But whatever it is that you as the listener hear or that you interpret for yourself, action is required. So this isn't about simply hearing something and mulling over it and kicking it to the curb. It's about saying, what can I do in response to that? So the energy of this new moon is requiring us to take steps in another direction from the direction that we're going in at the present time. And finally, what I would say, just to reinforce what your comment about beliefs, the Sagittarian beliefs, and we'll do some more deep diving on this shortly, is that of course Sagittarius is opposite Gemini, and Gemini is the house of communication and childhood learning, what I call the house of content. And what I mean by content is that the content that we have within our consciousness, either consciously aware of what we know and our knowledge, or unconsciously we hold within our consciousness, that content was put there, and this is this classic nature or nurture. So there's a combination of how did that content which builds our beliefs that we express in Sagittarius, how did that content get there in the first place? And it's a combination of, this is why we often refer to Gemini and the opposite of Sagittarius is so important to understand the basis of your beliefs. If Gemini is where we absorbed from our parents, we absorb from our friends, we absorb from the media, we absorb from our families, we absorb from role models, we absorb from all around us a whole bunch of content which we have then structured at different stages through our lives into a set of beliefs, Sagittarius, that we live by. And those inputs are very important to grasp and understand as the foundation for our Sagittarian beliefs, because not all of that input we asked for. Sometimes as children, we were thrust into situations not of our making. We were imposed upon by well-meaning brothers, sisters, parents, uncles, aunties, even television programs that had no discretion or discernment about the messages that they were embedding in us. So the Gemini content, which is the root of Sagittarian beliefs, is fundamental to this discussion that we have today. But the moon adds yet another dimension to that content, because the moon is what we call the repository of soul. So as much as we're getting influenced, our beliefs are influenced in childhood through our interactions with other human beings and through digital media as well, through screens, we're also influenced internally by our soul memories. And our soul memories are contained within the archetype of the moon, which is very strongly featured here, obviously. So we have content that builds our beliefs by which we live by, Sagittarius, and which we defend, Sagittarius, that have come from a combination of physical environment that we were exposed to, and internally they were just there, some of these beliefs that are connected to the quantum realms of parallel lives, past lives, other expressions of who we are that are present in our awareness, but we might not necessarily know where they came from. They might have come from our genetics, and we talked about the moon as the repository of soul, but also representing lineage and roots. So we may have and resonate to certain beliefs that you talk about in Sagittarius, and we're going to talk specifically about some of those beliefs around gender, around the role of the masculine and the feminine, which is coming through with the Mars and the Venus energy and the moon and the sun energy. So these beliefs, just to put this in a little bit of a box, is very specifically around all of our individual and collective beliefs and understanding about the role of the masculine and the feminine, and how we came to understand those roles and how they play out both in our lives and in the way we behave towards life itself, and how we react to our environments, whether it be in formal environments like work or school or sports teams or a social gathering, you name it. But some of those beliefs were given to us through teaching and reinforced to us through the learning process of the third house of Gemini. But we also came into this life with a set of beliefs and understanding that reside in that moon archetype, which means that they're coming from somewhere else. They're coming from either our lineage, literally our genetics, or they're coming from other experiences we've had in other dimensional realities that are remembered by the soul. So we have to consider that there's both an outer influence on our beliefs and an inward influence on our beliefs that start with the moon and Gemini as well. So that's the third and the fourth house, in fact. We have to think about that before we even get to talking about the Sagittarian beliefs, because the root of that goes back to that third and fourth house.
And it definitely, just to go more into the soul memory aspect of the moon, it is in energy healing very common that there are trapped emotions stored in your physical body that were not yours. They came in either through your mum's or dad's lineage, things that got picked up by potentially a grandparent, or phobias. Like I know myself that I cannot recall certain phobias or big dislikes that I have with certain things, but my mum remembers something happening to her. So there is a very big possibility that got put into the DNA as such, and now I'm carrying that into this lifetime. So it is the internal part, whether that is the on the soul, let's call it that, on the soul, or on the physical body initially. And then if you're born as a female, then you'll be put in pink dresses, you'll get a little headband, and if you're a boy, you'll be rocking cool slippers that look like soccer boots, for example. And it's not often that swaps. We don't put headbands on boys, but we'll get into that shortly. Do you want to continue on this, or shall we briefly tap into one of the relationships that the sun and moon are making during this new moon with Neptune and Saturn?
Well, I think we can integrate all of it in so much as the message here that I'm interpreting at this new moon, the message from the universal intelligence that I am picking up, is that the masculine and the feminine, the beliefs that we have around the roles of the masculine and the feminine and the way that we behave as individuals and collectively, and the way historically that human species has behaved, a lot of it, as you mentioned before, is tied up with the Age of Pisces, right? The patriarchal system that has very much instituted, which is this influence of the square that you're talking about. There's a square from the new moon through to Saturn and Neptune. And Saturn, as we've talked about before, represents institutional power. Now, what are institutions? When you look at the word institution, if you look at the etymology of institution, many people will think that an institution is a physical manifestation or representation. So we think of church as an institution or state as an institution. But yet, if we look at those two, very much you can look at the institution of religion or church, and you can see it expressed in the physical world through steeples, stained glass windows, Christ on the cross, Bibles in pews, eating of the bread, and there's a lot of physical expressions of the institution of religion, which incorporates many of these gender roles that we touched on before, the masculine and the feminine, where in most religious institutions around the world, no matter where they are located, no matter what part of the planet they are, and amongst the 190 to 200 countries, you will find that there's a consistent theme in most religious institutions that reinforces this male-female polarity, insofar as the minister will be a male. Or if you do confession, it is to a male priest. And there had been tremendous battles historically around the role of the male. Why is it that the male is the only one that holds the so-called keys to the kingdom? And that institution, as an example of how these beliefs that we are learned and then are reinforced as children, are actually a combination of system beliefs, cultural beliefs, and family beliefs, where great-grandma went to this particular church and followed this particular doctrine, so we're going to do it as well. in honour of her. And we can see that institutional manifestation of beliefs very physically represented. But then you have another institution, say the institution of state, or the institution of media, or the institution of politics, for example, or the institutions of ethics or justice. Many of these great institutions that we both believe in and that in a way actually reflect to us the way that we should believe. Like if we think about the justice system and we think about how that plays out, there may not be a physical representation of the justice system initially, because it's just a belief that I will behave in a particular way because that is acceptable to others. And if I don't behave in a particular way, or I behave in a way that is unacceptable to others, then the physical institutional power then comes into it. Might mean a policeman coming to the door. It might mean being pulled over on the side of the road and given a ticket. It might mean, say, in the case of taxes, not paying your taxes or getting a bill, right? So there is both a combination of a belief and the physical manifestation of that, and that's the square to Saturn here. So the square to Saturn represents that these beliefs that we have learned in childhood, or that we fostered and developed, or that we inherited, as you say, both through our genetics and through our soul memories, there's a combination of how we interact with them and deal with them. Some of it's physical. We physically go into a hospital, the institution of healthcare. We physically go and sit down at school in the institution of education. We physically go into a court of law if we've broken the law. We physically go and sit at a church. But there is also another aspect of these beliefs and the institutions, and what actually gives those physical manifestations of beliefs, those Saturnian structures, what gives them power is our belief that we give to them. You see, if we all stopped believing that, breaking the law, let's say the speed limit is 100 kilometers an hour, 60 miles an hour if you're in a different part of the world, and we all stopped, everybody, the whole society stopped following that, the institution of the police and the enforcement would collapse, because it would become so overwhelmed that they would just give up. And so those Saturnian institutional structures of belief actually exist because we as a species give them belief. We assign to them belief. And there's a virtuous circle here, in a way, that it sort of this reinforcement. As they show us the way to behave and what to believe, we give the power back to them by not resisting that. And part of the Neptune energy, which is the other part of the square, and the Mars energies, we talked before, many times we've talked about Neptune being the guardian of Pisces, and that Pisces is the sign of dissolution and emergence. We dissolve in Pisces or Neptune, and we emerge in Aries or Mars. So we have a nice combination of the square between Mars and Neptune, which is actually reinforcing that idea that some of these beliefs are going to dissolve. Some of these beliefs we need to allow them to run their course, and we need to recognize that the institutional power of Saturn has lost its bearings. It's no longer functioning in a way that serves the best for humanity. So there's quite a complicated interaction and interplay there between the new moon and the masculine and the feminine roles that very much come through in these Saturnian structures. We were touching on many of those roles before, and I'm sure we'll talk a little bit more about that, and how it ties back to exactly what you said, is as a little boy learns to be a fireman, or he learns to be a soldier, and the little girl learns to be the nurse, or she learns to be the stay-at-home mother. And that is reflected in the institution of marriage, the institution of military, the institution of education, the institution of these social services. Neptune Mars is saying that some of that needs to be put on the table, both individually and collectively, under the Sagittarian umbrella of beliefs, and the cosmos source intelligence source is saying, folks, it's time to have another look at that stuff. Look at where it came from. Is it soul memories that need to be rewired, reconfigured, revisited? Is it genetics that need to be looked at again and dealt with? Or is it your systems, the actual systems that need to be, let's say, not destroyed or removed, but certainly reconfigured, refreshed, re-looked at?
Yeah. Yes, and the education system institution here in New Zealand, the majority of teachers, especially at primary school, is very much female dominated. The nurses working in the hospital is very much female dominated. And I remember that there were riddles, and it was something along the lines, there is a boy and his parent, it's taking him to work, and it turns out that this parent was a female doctor, but the way that the riddle was shaped was, at the end of it, you're like, but how can the mum be the you couldn't figure it out how they could be one and the same. And that's because we've been, I don't want to say slowly, because it's happened from day dot, but as a society we have let it happen that as a female we tend to believe that you become the nurse, not the doctor. You don't become the engineer, you stay the stay-at-home parent. And I think that stems from in the middle of the 20th century, where females were not allowed to attend university, and so we weren't given the same platform to then accelerate our career from. And therefore now there is this massive divide between how many female and male doctors are in the hospital. But also here in New Zealand we've been having a lot of people fighting for pay equality, that a female cleaner should get paid just as much as a male counterpart in a similar industry. Because why wouldn't they? It's the same type of work, but for some reason females get paid less. So it's a very big subject to talk about, because who's right and who's wrong? What beliefs did you grow up with? Were you very much told by your grandma that as the first female grandchild, your role was going to be stay at home, and then as your mum gets unwell, then you'll take the mum in the house? So after your own children are out of the house, you'll still stay home because you'll have to look after the elderly. So such a deep dive into the way we've been brought up and the systems, the institutions around us that have been shaped by the Saturnian patriarchal way of doing things.
Yeah, and it's, everywhere you look, you could spend hours talking about all the different examples of institutional enshrinement, of some of these beliefs that came out and that were taught and that were reinforced often generation after generation after generation. And this is what I mean, is that at the root of some of that may have been a grandmother or a great-grandmother who is a reflection of the culture of the time. And we look at this when we think about, the Strauss-Howe theory and the demographics of the fourth turning. And you and I were talking about this the other day, about how there are these names have been assigned to these different generations, and the generations last something like 15 to 20 years each, more or less. You've got Gen Zs, you've got millennials, or Gen Ys is the other name for them. You've got Gen Xs, you've got baby boomers, you've got the GI generation, you've got the silent generation. And people are a reflection to a great extent of the environment, not only the environment within the home, which is a microcosm often of the macrocosm. And the macrocosm is these big generational kind of characteristics, if you like, that bleed into the education system, that bleed into the health system, that bleed into the legal system, the media, that come through the books we read, and the music we listen to, and the radio stations, and the way that the DJs talk, and all the rest of it is often a reflection of a cultural kind of wave that's going through. And there are very distinct, the demographers, particularly Strauss-Howe, that we both have been, digesting some of their content, is that influence is massive. If great-grandma is part of the GI generation, which went through the First World War, the Second World War, went through a time of economic hardship, of repression of voices, then the institutions of religion were, in a way, a response to that, because that was a way that people would come together and congregate and feel like they were part of something. And the fact that the minister was standing at the top was giving them meaning by his preachings or reading verses from the Bible, for example, was actually a way of soothing the anxieties of that group of people, who were a reflection of very difficult cultural and generational pressures that were ultimately, in this discussion, we assign to Saturn's institutional power. So the role of Saturn and Neptune is, we don't have the opportunity here to talk about all of those expressions of institutional power. We would love to hear from you, the listeners, some examples of where you feel that institutions have thrust a belief on you that you are now willing to have another look at. And for example, what was one of the illustrations examples we talked about before was, if you look at the education system in the West, the Westminster system, and the idea of, it's changed slightly, but it's still, the root of it is what they call the 3 R's, which again, the words have changed, but it used to be arithmetic, it's now arithmetic or math. But you had to learn the 3 R's in school. It was arithmetic, it was reading, and it was writing. Of course, reading still starts with an R, but writing's had a W put on the front of it. But it used to be writing was R-I-T-I-N-G, arithmetic and reading. That was the basis of the educational system, developed in London in the Westminster system, which propagated through the institution of the British Empire. So the British Empire developed this educational system, the 3 R's. They propagated it around the world using their empire, which was built off the back of military conquest and the ability to sail the 7 seas, where the British Empire had what was called the Commonwealth nations, the largest modern day empire, even bigger than the American empire, because America really is only the United States and perhaps a few proxies. So this British Empire spread these beliefs about education, or the 3 R's of being the foundation of education, and beliefs, right? You had to learn writing, you had to learn arithmetic, and you had to learn how to read, and that was it. That has been around since the 1850s. The 1850s. The institution of economics has been around since 1776. And we've talked before about that. Beliefs, for example, in the West, where the institutions of central banks have such an influence over all of those people who have a mortgage, and we talk about in New Zealand, 350 to 400,000 people are absolutely focused on the economic institution coming from the central bank, which is an idea of economics based in 1776. Allopathic medicine, same sort of story. I use those examples of medicine, economics, and education to illustrate where the Sagittarian limits of thinking have run into the institutional power, which is now breaking at the seams, and the Neptune and Mars influence of this new moon are saying that those limits are being tested, and that some of those institutional beliefs, and therefore in beliefs that we have as individuals, because if you were educated in that Westminster system, as both you and I were, even today, the kids are still educated. There's still a core curriculum is reading, writing, and math. It still exists today. It doesn't matter whether the kids are suited to that or not, or there might be a different way of learning. That is the question of the new moon. Is where has the institutional power of beliefs, Sagittarius, run its course? Where has it hit its limits, Neptune, 12th house energy, and what is going to emerge when these things invariably collapse and dissolve? And how will they collapse? They will collapse through conversations like this, from a ground up consensus where people start to ask questions about their beliefs. And this is where we get to the heart of the Sagittarian dogma, and how Sagittarius very much is where we absolutely, as an individual and as a society, defend those beliefs. This is what leads to separation and polarization and tribalism and nationalism. These are all beliefs. We must shut. One of the greatest beliefs at the moment is that around immigration. The belief that we as countries and nations, this is everywhere, must shut your borders, because we can't have people coming in. That's a belief that is incredibly enshrined in the institutions of power and politics. And we will enforce that border policy with armed troops and punitive actions, because we are going to wall ourselves off. That is the Sagittarian energy running its course. That is the centaur, the horse anchored to the ground, but aiming for the stars, but you're stuck. Sagittarius, when you look at that icon of the centaur, it's actually ironically stuck. You have this archer aiming for the sky, but he is not able to go any quicker than the horse to which he is attached. And the horse represents our animal instincts and our grounding to the physical reality. So this is a slow burn process. But like the horse, when it finally breaks free and roams around, that's also what we've got to start doing with our beliefs, is roaming around in our beliefs.
So you mentioned before that if we all stopped adhering to the speed limit, then the police will no longer be able to enforce that. If we take a step back and take more of a spiritual spin on it, do you believe that we could apply something like the Maharishi Effect to these institutions, to the beliefs that it only takes a small portion of humanity to break free of these institutions and have change?
Absolutely. That Maharishi experiment, for those who haven't and are unfamiliar with it, we encourage you to check it out. Because yes, this is absolutely why we talk about 13 sign astrology. As an institution, we are running up against the institution of the 12 sign system, which, by the way, is 2,000 years old. Was created in the Roman Empire as a collusion between the Ptolemy, who was an astronomer and advisor to the Roman Senate, and the Babylonians. And they removed the 13th sign and they put in the Libra sign and they did a whole bunch of stuff. Well, that's a belief. That's a set of beliefs. And so the Maharishi in that context for us is we only need a small number of people to actually come into alignment with their divine design, their 13 sign system, and they will suddenly find themselves expressing their passion, their path that was intended for them. That in fact, I would even say this, that they as higher selves intended for this lifetime. We only need, there's 8 billion people on the planet. 1 million people who were in alignment with the divine design and the 13 sign system would be enough to change the institution of the 12 sign system. That's all it would take, which would be a Maharishi example of that. So yes, totally agree. And this is why I love the discussion, and I'm not being too prescriptive about it, because there are so many institutions, and there will be people listening who have an absolute passion about the institution of law. They have a passion about the institution of education. They have a passion about the institution of school boards, of education, of governance, of science, of technology, of, all of these things. It takes a small number of really awake and aware people to move the needle, and profoundly do that. So yes, that's absolutely a great illustration of what talking about and socializing these ideas can have as an impact on your local community and the broader species of human beings. And in fact, the other thing I'd add to that, came to me then, is for those that believe in the human design system, this is the 33rd gene key. This is this idea of that there is tremendous impulses for change at the what they call the edge of chaos. If you look at chaos theory, systems thinking and chaos theory, they talk about the edge of chaos. And if you look at genetics, and we were talking about this the other day, you look at a flock of seagulls. I don't know whether they're all over the world, but certainly seagulls all look the same. But within that genetic species, there are some seagulls who are actually resonating differently, even though outwardly they look exactly the same. And it is those ones that are resonating differently, which is actually a function of genetics. The genetic expression is coming through. So part of the Maharishi is not only an intellectual belief, but this goes back to what we started with the moon and the lineage and roots, is that genetics are actually turning on. And just like, there are certain times, and this is only known to source consciousness, by the way. There are certain times where genetic strands or genome expressions within the human genome will switch on and others will switch off. And part of the expression that I think that humanity has been bullied into is that we believe in those authority figures. Like we're being programmed to believe that we have to have a man telling us what to do and where to go and leading us forward. And if you look at the great stories, even in the Bible itself, most of the great luminaries are males. In fact, I mean, apart from Mary, I cannot think off the top of my head of any of the great stories which are therefore the morals of how to live, which are therefore beliefs. I can't think of any that females off the top of my head. Moses, David, Socrates, Jesus, Matthew, Mark, Paul, Luke, it's all male. Maybe in the genome, in our soul memory, there's a genetic change also happening, i.e. the 33rd gene key, where there's actually a trigger point in the timing of all of this, where some of these beliefs actually begin to explode because we resonate differently, which is another part of the Maharishi, is that perhaps people are starting to resonate differently. Yeah. And what we do here, as are others, is building a community of people that don't need to be interacting with each other, but just need to be sort of coalesced. And as those beliefs bounce around within that community, suddenly they permeate out, and that's what also has an effect on the wider collective.
Yeah. Shall we leave it there?
Yep.
It was a fascinating discussion on the way we see ourselves, the institutions around us. If you are ready for change and embrace the true divine design for this lifetime, hit us up for a chat to see where the planetary bodies actually were in the night sky at your time of birth, so that you can fully embrace those energies and become part of us that want to see change in the world. And to see change, we have to be the change. You can listen to all our videos on YouTube. You can also catch our podcasts on numerous podcast platforms, including Spotify and Apple Podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in during our 2025 season. We wish you a Merry Christmas if you celebrate, and see you next year. Ngā mihi.
Namaste.
Until then.